Good afternoon. My name is Jane Campbell, and I'm here with my distinguished colleague, Timothy Lee, to talk to you today about the power and possibility of opportunity zones. And just so you have a quick understanding of who we are that are conducting this webinar today, I served in elected life in Cleveland, Ohio, and in the state legislature, county commissioner, and ultimately as mayor of Cleveland. Had a small business of my own doing economic development consulting, and worked at Harvard in the Kennedy School, and then was able to come to Washington, where I served as Senator Landrieu's chief of staff. Can you give me a glass of water? Senator Landrieu's chief of staff, and served as the staff director of the Small Business Committee. And then was the director of the Washington office for the National Development Council, working on policy matters related to community economic development. And I am now doing consulting with communities, particularly those that are interested in opportunity zones, and have the honor to be a senior fellow here at the International Economic Development Council. As you can see, most of my work has been in the public sector. We are honored to have with us Timothy Lee, who has been looking at this from the investor side of the house. His background is in municipal finance. He too has a public sector activity as a high-ranking official in the United States Department of Treasury, has worked with the USDA on their investment programs, and is now working at Signet Partners, that works with investors that are trying to make investments that are meaningful to communities. And so we are privileged to have him with us. So let us just quickly understand. I know that some of you have lots of information about opportunity zones, some have a little. So I just want to real quickly point out how we got here. The opportunity zones legislation is one of the rare bipartisan activities that Congress has actually enacted. It was incorporated into the tax reform bill led by Senator Scott and Senator Booker, Democrat and Republican, joined in the House by Representative Pat Tiberi, who's a Republican, and Ron Kind, who's a Democrat. What does the opportunity zone actually, what does this incentive really mean? There are three critical incentives. One is the temporary deferral, which is that an investor can defer their capital gains taxes until the end of 2026 if they invest those gains into a qualified opportunity fund. Second part of that is that there's a step up in basis which reduces the tax liability if, in fact, you hold the investment for 5 years and then another incentive if you hold it for 7 years. But the most important, really the very most important issue is that the investments that are made in the qualified opportunity fund in the opportunity zone will be free from capital gains taxes. And I've noted from one of our attendees asked, will this PowerPoint be available? The answer is yes. At the conclusion of the webinar, you will get a thank you note with a survey from IEDC. And if you fill out the survey, we use that in order to understand what people are interested in and how did it work. At the end of the survey, there's a link to get the PowerPoint. So don't worry about trying to take screenshots of all these things as they're moving along. It will be available to you. And I also want to give credit for the graphics in this little section to the Economic Innovation Group, which is the think tank that was really behind the thought process for the creation of the opportunity zones. So Tim, you can chime in on this. If you look at the mechanics, you see the individual taxpayers invest in the Opportunity Fund, and the Opportunity Fund invest in the Qualified Opportunity Zone business property, Qualified Opportunity Zone partnership interests in business, and Qualified Opportunity Zone stock. So this is not a direct investment. The investments must be made through the Qualified Opportunity Fund.
That's right, Jane. And it's important to note here that these are limited specifically to equity investments. We'll go over the details shortly, including important aspects of the new regulations released by Treasury scarcely over a week ago. But the idea, enshrined in the legislation, is for individual taxpayers, including corporations and institutions liable to pay United States income tax, to invest their capital gains through an opportunity fund, specifically for business property and for equity interests in these opportunity zones.
And there are three components to opportunity zones, and many economic development professionals have worked primarily with debt instruments. Most of the New Markets Tax Credit, Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, the HUD 108 loan programs are all related to long-term, lower interest debt. This is different. This is an equity investment. And so we look at it, there are three components to the opportunity zone. One is the investments. And as Tim says, the opportunity funds make equity investments in businesses and business property. They make it through the second component of an opportunity zone, which is a fund, a qualified opportunity fund, which is an investment vehicle that is organized for this specific purpose, that has a set of rules that we're going to talk about, and the opportunity zone designation. The opportunity zone designation has been done by Treasury and is now in effect for the next 10 years. Let's talk for a minute about the types of property that are eligible. Tim, do you want to walk us through the types of property, the stock, partnership, and business property?
Sure. For the three key property types are, the two of them basically fall under the larger umbrella of equity. Stock of a corporation located in an opportunity zone, a partnership interest, which is, which would be equity interest in, not held in the stock format, and then business property, tangible business property. This encompasses equipment, owned or leased. This also encompasses, very importantly, real estate located in qualified opportunity zones. The law states that a qualified opportunity zone business must use substantially all of its tangible property within a zone. It must meet a few additional tests. One of the most important aspects of the recent draft regulations is that it proposes to set the substantially all test at 70% of the cost basis of the building itself. There are a few important exceptions to this. Investments that don't qualify include funds of funds, certain excluded businesses. You can't build a golf course, for example. You can't invest in package stores and opportunity zones, and financial institutions themselves. We're also going to talk about a substantial improvement test, which applies unless the business property is bought for original use.
And we've had a couple questions that we're going to get to as we move along about how you set up an opportunity fund. We'll be talking about that, and how you deal with existing property. So we see that those questions are coming in, and it will be coming up as we move forward. So we tried to look at this from the perspective of what is the impact on an investor. Because early movers, the ones who are moving even while the regulations were in development, and now that we have the draft regulations, will be the ones who will set the stage. Now that we have the draft regulations presented, taxpayers can rely on those draft regulations until the regulations are final. So we are in a much better position to move forward, because that deferral of capital gains taxes gives the opportunity zone investors a larger investment opportunity up front, and the reduction in the basis is something that first if you hold it for 5 years, then if you hold it for 7 years. And so if you look at the time frame, in order to meet that 7-year hold period for the initial deferral, you really have to make your investments by December 31st, 2019 for the deferral component to have the maximum benefit. But for the exclusion of the new investments, that can go much further into the future. Do you have anything you want to say on this? So here is the pictorial example. So Tim, why don't you walk people through this fine picture where you see the investor investing in the zone and what happens with the tax?
Sure. The next few slides basically are a abbreviated tour of the decision process and how the opportunity zones are likely to play out. The investor, looking from the perspective of today, has a realized capital gain. For example, he's bought a technology stock that has done very, very well. He bought it at 100, he sells it at 200, and owning 10 shares of it, he realizes a capital gain of $1,000. There are two things he can do with it now with the new provision. One, he can pay federal income tax on his capital gains today, the way he always could, or if he wants, he could choose to invest in the opportunity zone. The capital gains tax is less than completely appetizing. He basically has to pay up to 23.8% of this capital gain up front, in addition to state taxes that may be applicable. The opportunity zone, in contrast, offers deferral of this federal tax, plus, as we've mentioned before, elimination of taxes on returns to potential elimination of taxes for returns to these investments held over the long term. Next slide.
So then we see what happens when you actually make the investment in an opportunity fund. There will be a fund manager who will manage the fund and make sure that they keep track of the rules. But one of the interesting things before we get into the slide is that the Treasury has specifically said this is going to be a light touch regulation. And the first indication of that is that the certification as a qualified opportunity fund is simply that you self-certify when you fill out your taxes.
This is consistent with the current administration's philosophical viewpoint toward lighter regulation in general. You'll see in the in subsequent slides there is already a draft IRS Form 8996 that funds will use to self-certify and to confirm compliance with key tests over the life of the fund.
So what we have here is we really want to show you what does this mean to the investor, and why is the opportunity zone a meaningful community economic development tool. You know that the stock market has been extremely strong over the last 10 years, really. And so as a result, there are a number of people who have what's called unrealized capital gains, which is that their stock portfolio is worth a lot more than it once was, but they aren't investing that money because of the capital gains tax. And so the architects of the opportunity zone investment strategy created this in order to encourage people who have those unrealized capital gains, aka increased stock portfolio, to sell some of that stock and invest it in America's most distressed communities. So when you do that, we now have a chart that's going to show you what it means in a dollars and cents way. Are we ready for that one?
Sure. Yep. So through the life of the fund, the 10 years of this example, how would those two choices play out? An investment, a hypothetical investment outside the opportunity zone, there are a couple of important things to glean from this graph. First of all, Uncle Sam, outside of an opportunity zone, is going to take his bite out of your gain twice. Once on the front end with federal capital gains taxes, and then again on the back end when capital gains taxes would apply to whatever appreciation would be on the investment of the original corpus over 10 years. By contrast, opportunity zone investments have a couple of very important advantages. First of all, from the word go, you don't have to invest just the amount that's been haircutted for capital gains taxes. You can invest your entire capital gain. In this case, you can invest the entire $1,000, and over time you have that much more money to work for you. Second, federal capital gains taxes. We talk about the basis step up. They're reduced in absolute amounts, and they're deferred so that you only have to pay capital gains taxes once on your investment by 2028, and your asset appreciation, again subject to meeting the requirements, is tax exempt. The upshot of this, the result, is a significantly bigger pie over a long-term investment horizon, which is exactly what the authors of the legislation were looking for. If you invest $1,000, assuming a 7% return, you are looking at over $400 in difference to an investor in this example.
Well, actually, you do pay the deferred taxes. You ultimately pay. It's $202, but it's $211 in net positive to the investor. The investor in one example pockets $1,764 after taxes, $1,765, and in the other example he pockets $1,323. So again, a meaningful difference, right, and one that's going to, because of these two key advantages, is going to incentivize investors looking at this space. So we wanted to do this with $1,000 just because I know your investments that you're dealing with are going to be multiples of $1,000. But if you look at it, the change in what you pay, what the investors will pay for taxes, is what will give them a willingness to take an equity position that has a slightly lower rate of return than a traditional equity investor. And so that's why this program was developed, in order to drive investment into our most low-income communities. Someone asked about their opportunity zone is residential and concern about what would be the investment possibility. There is real estate. This investment strategy works extremely well with investment in real estate. And so in a primarily residential area, you could have multifamily real estate. You could have a variety of real estate investments that might be appropriate for that particular zone. And we are going to be talking about what local communities can do to really understand each zone. There is a map which we are going to show you and tell you how to access it, which you can get from the United States Department of Treasury, and you can take any address and link through the map to find out if it's in an opportunity zone You can look up where the opportunity zones are in any state, in any community, and so you will be able to find where are the opportunity zones within your community if you don't know that already. And this chart is just the background for the graphic that we just showed you. And as we said earlier, the link to this PowerPoint will be available if you fill out the survey that will come to you at the end of the webinar. So we wanted you to have the data so you could understand how those numbers were calculated. And Tim, you did this work. Maybe you should tell them a little bit what it is.
It's a hypothetical example, but it gives you an idea of how much of a difference the opportunity zone stands to make for investors. And again, this is really, if you have a good, sensible project, the opportunity zone provisions act as a boost for committed long-term investors. They're not going to make a bad project good, but they will make a solid project that much better, that much more appealing to investors. I'm happy to talk about, I'm happy to field questions offline. My contact information is at the back of the slide for folks who may want to discuss the numbers in a little more detail. And
so this chart will answer one of the questions someone asked of how do you determine what the net investment value is to the investor.
We've run some preliminary numbers, and in a commercial real estate, in a multifamily setting, we come up under fairly standard scenarios with significant boosts to IRR on the order of several percentage points. Just to give you an idea, it makes a genuine difference.
So we wanted to bring you up to date on the Treasury Department has now come out with guidance just Friday before last, October 19th, and this is a link. So for the real policy wonks among you, you can link through and read the entire document. We are not going to read it to you, but we are going to give you the highlights and the summaries. What is important is that the comment period on this round of guidance is open until December 28th, 2018. And this link will show you how to make a comment. And I noticed that in one of the questions is that there was a concern that someone had used the Treasury map and found there to be an inaccuracy in it. And that would be the kind of thing you could put in the comments to raise that question. We actually have not had people indicate that there is an inaccuracy problem, but if there is, that's something that we're happy to try to work with. Similarly, as we go through the comments, there are some areas where Treasury said we are looking for feedback from the field, particularly on the substantial investment, because they've set that 70% of the tangible property must be used within the opportunity zone. There are some, they want to know what is your sense, those working in the field, does that seem reasonable? There's a couple of things that have been put forward in terms of how to deal with working capital where they have invited comments. And so as you listen to us talk about what is the latest guidance, you might be thinking about, does that sound reasonable? Are there other questions? And it would be the time to write your comments between now and Christmas. They're December 28th, but you might do it before Christmas.
As a former Treasury Department employee, I can tell you that comments are not just solicited, but they're read very carefully, and people, they do make an impact. People want to know, how this is going to play out in real life, and they're looking for input. So your comments, to the extent that you have them, you have a voice, it will make a difference. And
we're going to get to all the questions when we finish the presentation, and I think let's finish the presentation on the guidance before we try to answer the questions, because some of these questions that are coming through are things that we are going to address. And so we'll go back and make sure that we do address them. So first question is land and buildings. Because there is a requirement that you have to do a substantial improvement, one of the questions that was asked is, if you purchase a property, you purchase the land and the building, how do you distinguish, how do you substantially improve land? Land is land. And so the Treasury has clarified that land does not require substantial improvement. Buildings require substantial improvement, and substantial improvement means that an investment that meets or exceeds the cost basis, which is usually the purchase price of the building that you have purchased. And clarifying that land does not have to be improved is really going to be very important for creating more opportunity for investment. The substantially all threshold, you want to take that one, Tim?
Sure. There is a 90% test in the statute that 90% of the assets of any opportunity fund must be situated in opportunity zones or invested in opportunity zone businesses. The opportunity zone businesses themselves must have substantially all of their tangible property located within an opportunity zone. The new guidance has set substantially all as at least 70% for determining whether tangible property, operations, leased assets are qualified opportunity zone business property. So you could have a situation where 90% times 70% of the assets in a qualified opportunity zone are qualified or are within an opportunity zone. That gives you some leeway. For example, if you have a chain of toy stores, 4 of the toy stores are in opportunity zones. One of them is outside. That would meet the substantially all test, and it would be eligible for investment in an opportunity zone, which then would account among the 90% test necessary for compliance by this opportunity fund.
And similarly, one of the reasons that this substantially all at 70% is important is if you have, for example, a manufacturing plant and you are dealing with inventory, and your inventory is not all within the zone, it's some is placed elsewhere, and things are moving through in and out of the zone, having the 70% of the property will give you the opportunity to run a business in a reasonable manner. This is the self-certification form, so you can see it. Again, this is something that the Treasury has asked for comments on. Take a look at the form, see if it seems reasonable. It's designed to be very straightforward and simple for a taxpayer to fill out. Now, the structure of a fund is one of the things that's addressed in the guidance. Clarification that qualified opportunity funds can be LLCs, they can be partnerships, they can be corporations. They can be, in fact, an individual can establish a qualified opportunity fund. The only issue is that there is in the legislation a prohibition against self-dealing. So I can't establish a qualified opportunity fund in order to invest in my own personal property. I can create a qualified opportunity fund to invest in property that is nearby or in Tim's property, Tim can invest in my property with a qualified opportunity fund, and a qualified opportunity fund can invest in multiple projects or in one project. You want to say anything more about the structure of the fund?
The other point I would make is that some specific types of structures, including registered investment companies and real estate investment trusts, are eligible for treatment and tax benefits under the under the opportunity fund structure. That was something that was that had been that folks had sought clarification for, and the new guidance clarifies that folks and taxpayers specifically eligible to receive such benefits include individuals, partnerships, and corporations, including RICs and REITs. That's going to be something that was very important, largely because folks in those sorts of companies had been keeping an eye out for that guidance.
And perhaps one summary question is that the opportunity zone investment strategy enables a good project to be an excellent project. It will not take a project that really doesn't have economic viability and make it viable. It's not a large enough subsidy to do that, but it is something that would take a project that might need just a little push to get it over the edge, or needs some longer term investment, and by having this be patient long-term equity, it allows the project to pencil out over time. So one of the other things that is in the rules that is something that came forward from comments that were sent to Treasury from the Opportunity Zone Coalition that I've been part of, and many of you have probably been part of, is that there's a working capital safe harbor for an investment. Any of you who've ever been involved in a real estate investment, for example, you have to line up the money on day one, but you don't spend the money on day one. You spend it over time. And so the working capital safe harbor provision establishes that if the money is held over a period of 31 months and is distributed based on a written plan of how the working capital will be spent to make the project actualized, and that the money is spent in a substantially consistent manner with that 31-month schedule, that you do not have to spend all the money on day one. And the reason that that matters so much in this particular instance is that the way this legislation was drafted is there are very specific timelines. From the time you experience a capital gain, you have 180 days to invest it in a opportunity zone fund. And so there's not a lot of time to be thinking about stuff, and the opportunity fund must have 90% of their dollars invested in qualified opportunity fund project investments, and there's a twice-a-year evaluation of the fund. And so one of the things that people who were trying to imagine implementing this began to worry about is how do you line this up? Because you have to really be, on the one hand, lining up potential investors, and on the other hand, be lining up potential investments and bring them in a timely manner. And this working capital safe harbor 31-month period allows a little bit of more reasoned flexibility to move this forward. So one of the things we return to is what are the key features of opportunity zones? Why are we having this conversation? Why does this matter? The way opportunity zones are designed it is extraordinarily flexible. Low-income communities come in many different shapes and sizes, urban and rural, different communities, and this tool is capable of working with all manner and sorts of other governmental investments that a community may make, whether that is infrastructure, whether that is other incentives, and make something that works in each community. Secondly, this opportunity zone investment strategy is scalable. Unlike new markets tax credit or low-income housing tax credit, community development block grant, there is not a cap on the amount of capital that can flow into a community. As long as you can develop projects that make sense, that are economically viable, and you have investors that are willing to make that investment, they can continue to make the investment and continue to experience the gain. And finally, opportunity zones are simple in that they don't compete with other public sector financing. The investment in the opportunity zone and the opportunity zone tax incentive is not up against the investment in a road or a bridge or a public school, because this is something that the federal government has established as an incentive. If you think of it, this is more like the mortgage tax credit than it is like new markets or low-income housing tax credit. The federal government gives you a mortgage tax credit when you file your taxes. They don't care where you bought a house, how much you paid for it, you know, what, or anything, you know, they don't care whether it's white, blue, green, whatever it's like, whether you bought a condo or whether you bought a house on the water, whatever. This is like that, as opposed to the low-income housing tax credit new markets, which is a very, you know, prescriptive, and you run out of money. There's only so much allocation, and then you're out of it.
There have been calculations indicating $6 trillion, that's trillion with a T, of unrealized capital gains that, you know, that conceivably could be reinvested in opportunity zones. And so I doubt, frankly, that all $6 trillion is going to make its way into the program, but still, that gives you some idea of the scale of possible investment that can be put to work in this area.
So someone had asked about how do we find the opportunity zones. There are 8,762 opportunity zones. They are census tracts. They've been designated now, and the designation lasts for 10 years. Don't think you're going to change it. It's done. It would take an act of Congress to change it. They're both urban and rural. And this is the link to the Treasury map. 76% are metropolitan, 24% are non-metropolitan. Included in the zones, there are 31.3 million residents. The entirety of Puerto Rico is an opportunity zone. This bill was moving through right after the hurricane, and so one thing that Congress could do was make all of Puerto Rico an opportunity zone. 10% of the nation's population lives in an opportunity zone, and already in the opportunity zones, there are 1.6 million businesses, 24 million jobs, and so that this investment strategy can build on that. Here's the map, which is just a screenshot that shows you the Treasury map, and if you go to it through the link on the earlier one, it is live and you can press through it.
It's interesting and important to point out that the map itself is impressive, but it understates the extent of urban opportunity zones. There are, for example, 133 opportunity zones just within the city of Chicago. Those are by nature smaller in geographical extent, but they're they're positioned to have an impact, obviously, on more people. So take the map with a general sense, but these opportunity zones are across the country, positioned where the need is.
And one of the questions that someone asked is, how do you set your opportunity zone? Because there's 8,000, how do you make yours stand out? And we're going to talk about that when we get to the section on what local leaders can do. So it's exactly the right question, and we're going to be there because this is in fact the slide that's up here talking about this is really a time for local leadership, and state and local governments have been imaginative and engaged. For example, in California, they decided they were going to have an opportunity zone focused from the state level. They have a major website that identifies the opportunity zones, and they're building a portal where they can put potential opportunity zone investments on that portal so that a potential investor can look and see what the state of California has already vetted as a quality investment. Washington, D.C. is considering doing a similar kind of thing. In Baltimore, Maryland just hired an opportunity zone czar to work in the development office, in the mayor's office. And what local economic development officers can do is look at their community map and then do almost a very quick micro plan for that area. You know your communities better than anybody else, and so you can say, in this area, we want housing here, we want retail here, we want commercial here, here's a place we want to work with the anchor institutions. In Cleveland, Ohio, we have hospitals that are often our anchor institutions, and working with them on the opportunity zones that are immediately adjacent to their property gives a potential for doing very imaginative investments in those areas. The other thing is that there's a real concern on the part of state and local government officials that the way opportunity zones are investments work, we want to make sure that we prevent displacement, and so that it doesn't just become a tool that enables investment that was going to happen anyway to be done in a way that pretty much prices people out of the neighborhoods they've been in forever. And one of the things that local communities can do is look at the other tools that are in the community development toolbox and make sure to use those in conjunction with a community plan that will also continue to provide opportunities for the people and the businesses that have been in those neighborhoods to stay, to grow, and to thrive.
We've made the point before that opportunity zones, by their nature, are targeted to equity investors. To that extent, that doesn't change the fact that a lot of these projects are going to be very capital intensive. They're going to lend themselves to debt financing to a very large extent. And rather than forcing investors to choose, the government's overall policy in this case is to complement the boost from opportunity zones largely with existing programs. For example, federal credit programs, tax-exempt capital markets, and complement each other in a holistic fashion rather than forcing the investor to choose.
So this is, when this program was developed, a lot of the people who were around the table had been working with community economic development. And one of the things that we learned over time is that too often the federal government would say, this is the latest new bright shiny program. And we're going to have this new bright shiny program, and we're going to prohibit it from working with the existing program. In opportunity zones, there was a specific permission to work with every program that exists. And that's why we made this little picture of the toolkit. And you can see how there is a complementary role for debt and equity to work together to make a project. Opportunity zone in investment, thank you, will be equity. But the debt may come from a combination of various local, state, federal subsidized debt programs, may come from traditional bank debt, or maybe what I've often called the baklava of financing, because there are so many layers to make it happen. People always tease me because I use food references, but you know, the good thing is everybody eats. So
it gives the equity investors in an opportunity zone project both the chance and the decision making, the empowerment to choose what's right for the particular circumstances, the particular project. You're not shoehorned into a particular set of decisions or a particular set of constraints. You are free as an investor to do what's right for the project and the community.
Which is why it's important for to look at local governments. Local governments have tools. Sometimes we don't even think necessarily about what are the tools local government has. Local government has land use zoning, and you know, that zoning can be something as straightforward as this is commercial, this is residential, you know, here's the setback, whatever. But it also can be in areas that are particularly hot markets. You may have inclusionary zoning. In Washington, D.C., there's a requirement that a certain percentage of new housing development be set aside for affordable housing. That's a tool that local government can have and can watch these areas over the 10-year time span. Local governments are the planners and can develop a redevelopment plan that is got to be met by any investor in a community, that may require that there is participation of the small, and particularly small and micro businesses that have been there keeping the community alive, even though distressed over time. Local governments also know their community and can do quickly an economic impact assessment that can be used by a potential investor. Local governments understand the social impact and realize that in many of these communities, the small businesses may not just be small businesses, they may be the community center, that sort of de facto, where they provide the social support. You know, the person who runs the local bodega is the one who really knows, you know, who's where and who's what in the neighborhood, and can make sure that those resources are respected. And finally, local governments control the other incentives and community investments, whether that's tax increment financing, community development, block grant, infrastructure development, workforce training opportunities. And a good local government engagement can bring those additional resources together. So how are things likely to proceed from here? You can see 2018, the map's in place, and people have asked a couple of times about the link to the map. The link to the map will be in the PowerPoint when you get the survey at the end of this webinar. At the end, you fill out the survey, and then you have the link to the actual is the recording and the webinar. Just the slides. You get the slides, and And so you'll have that link available to you. Also at the end, you'll have both Tim and my emails, and so you can contact us directly if you have a particular question. The open time for comments is available until December of 2018. We believe that in 2019, the bulk of the funds will begin to form and capitalize, and investment will begin to flow. And in 2021, the funds will begin to invest at scale and reach that 90% threshold. And so we should have a much better picture of what is really going on as we move forward. Ultimately, this is going to take a holistic engagement where community members, NGOs, local institutions, institutional investors, state and localities, and the federal government are all going to have to work together in order to get this outcome of housing, small businesses, large businesses, education, and infrastructure that will make a difference. Now we have multiple questions.
Yeah, and just to that point, I think it's worth reinforcing the last point that Jane made. She speaks from the perspective, as I know most of you are, of public sector, of someone with long experience in public sector, public sector and local government. I've spent a certain amount of time. I did a tour of duty in public sector, but my basic background is in investment and financial services. But the point remains the same. A lot of the folks looking from the investor perspective to get into this space are going to know the limits of their capabilities and their knowledge, and they're going to be looking for partners who know the situation on the ground, local governments, local economic development authorities, community development financial institutions, and they're going to know the best way to protect their investment is to have a holistic approach. If you attract a factory to town, but you don't have confidence in the schools, you wonder where your employees are going to live, you wonder if the infrastructure is there to support shipping your product around the country, then that increases the risk. It calls for a holistic structure, a holistic approach to developing your community. That's particularly true because the opportunity funds, once formed, are going to have to deploy their investment fairly quickly, and they're going to look for integrated packages for investments at scale in order to get their funds off the ground. This is absolutely a team sport. It's impossible to overemphasize that. And so really it's going to be a team effort that contributes to the success of these funds and to community development.
Thank you, Tim. That's very well said. And so now we're going to return to the questions. And we're working from the chat box. One of the questioners asked, does the investment have to be private funds? And can a public economic development organization be an investor? The investments have to be capital gains that are taxable under the federal capital gains rules. And so they have to come from a taxpayer who would be required to pay those taxes.
Certainly to get the full benefit of the tax preferences involved.
Now, that doesn't mean that in a project overall, you couldn't have an economic development organization investment, but the benefits that come from the opportunity zone strategy are tax benefits. And those tax benefits are only meaningful to taxpayers who owe taxes. And specifically, they are capital gains taxes. And so that's why it's really designed to get a certain kind of investor who might not otherwise be in the in this space to be involved.
The same general point holds, and we've seen a couple of other questions along the lines of can foreign investors participate? Can tax-exempt institutions such as foundations and nonprofits participate? And the same general point holds. You are definitely not going to get optimal benefit from the provisions of opportunity zones by investing if you fit such categories.
But if you look, for example, it's a good thing you brought up the foundations, because there are some foundations right now being led by Rockefeller and Kresge who are looking at how can they, as philanthropic entities, participate in opportunity zones as partners, doing side-by-side investments, doing guarantees, doing capacity building with local economic development entities that need to identify projects. And so there's a very meaningful interest on the part of those foundations in making sure that this program is actually all that it is hoped to be, or as close to that as possible.
They have a role at the table, just like many folks do, many current existing stakeholders. I guess the way I would put it is that one of the key goals of opportunity funds is to invite another person to the table, specifically equity investors with capital gains to reinvest in communities.
One of the questions is, can the lead investor also be the fund manager? The lead investor can certainly be the fund manager. There's no requirement that you have a separate fund manager. You do have the self-dealing issue. So the lead investor cannot be investing in his or her own property. And so someone asked about what are the qualifications for the fund manager. There are no qualifications set forth in the law for the fund manager.
Well, there are no formal qualifications, but as a practical matter, how I would expect most of these to be set up would be as a general partner, limited partner structure. Those of you with an investment background are going to be familiar with it. But typically, you have a designated party taking a leadership role in many investment decisions, and then other equity holders taking a more passive approach to decision making and simply reading the reports. As far as let's see, who makes the decision on a fund investment? Can the lead investor also be the fund manager? That's the key point I would make. The fund manager, there are no legal requirements that we know of yet, but as a practical matter, the fund manager is going to have to be someone with credibility in the space. And that goes to an important point, especially that I would want to emphasize for this audience. Credibility, it does come in the form of private sector investment management experience, but it also, again, comes in the form of knowing these communities, knowing the local economy, knowing the local needs and opportunities. That is where states, municipalities, economic development authorities have an absolutely critical role to play in the success of these projects.
And someone asked, can cities or other government entities establish opportunity funds to invest in their properties? Whether a city or another governmental entity can do that is really a function of local and state law. In Ohio, for example, you are not allowed to invest state dollars in private entities, but there is state liquor stores. The profit from state liquor stores is used as the economic development tool for the state. It's administered through something called Jobs Ohio. And that's how they do a variety of incentives and whatnot for development. So I think different communities are looking at whether they want to actually do the investment or whether they want to partner with someone else who is going to develop the Qualified Opportunity Fund. My opinion is that we will see more partnership, you know, as Tim talked about the team sport, where local governments will identify people who are, you know, experienced in this area, who would be willing to create the fund and manage the fund, and then work with the community. But that will be a community by community decision, again, referring back to the fact that this program is extraordinarily flexible. So how are the gains realized by investors, and what constitutes a project that is viable in terms of return on investment? Tim, you want to try to handle that one?
Sure. Gains are realized by the investors in a number of different ways. There are going to be certain sorts of assets, and this is true with or without opportunity funds, that people are going to want to invest in for cash flow. Commercial real estate comes to mind. Some folks are going to invest in more growth-oriented investments, such as startups, small businesses that tend to be sold on when they reach a certain stage of maturity. Potentially IPO'd is a possibility. This is one of the reasons for the provisions that you've seen and heard about reinvesting. But again, the returns to investors may come in the form of cash flow, dividends. It may come in the return, in the form of sales proceeds. It may come in the term, in the form of capital gains as well. So it really depends, just like any other investment. And the bogeys, I would expect that the bogeys people in the equity investment world are going to try to hit are going to be fairly similar to what they would expect for non-opportunity zone projects. But of course, non-opportunity zone projects don't have the benefit of these tax preferences. So again, you're going to end up hitting a fairly similar hurdle, but you're going to have a little extra boost to help you over it.
Someone asked the question of, can you make an investment that is not a capital gain in an opportunity fund and experience the later exemption? The answer to that is no. This is a program that is developed specifically for creating unrealized capital gains to become realized and be invested. And so you can't, take money out of your savings account and make that investment. It is really related specifically to capital gains. Here's a question. Will there be a directory of opportunity funds? And the answer to that is no. At this point, in the original legislation, there was a whole set of requirements that were related to transparency, accountability, and reporting. And because this measure was passed as part of the tax reform bill, there are rules in Congress called the Byrd rules that you can't drop in something that into the final that wasn't in either the House or the Senate side. And so there is no policy around transparency and accountability. There's a lot of concern about that, but there is nothing in the statute that Treasury can hook its regulations to. So what we have seen is that they've developed, particularly with the Economic Innovation Group, they have been collecting a number of people who are doing opportunity funds, who have worked with them, and they have an informal list that they keep on their website of people who are doing creating opportunity funds, but there's not a Treasury designated list. But if you go to the Economic Innovation Group website, they have probably the very best compilation of information. There are other groups that also have a lot of information, but I would just start with EIG. One of the questions is about tribal entities. Can tribal entities use these funds? In Washington State, I know that the tribes were very much engaged in the designation of zones. The governor of Washington made a determination that he was going to engage the tribes in establishing where the zones were and that they can be done on tribal lands. So a tribal entity would have the same issue that a foundation or anyone else. You have to be a taxpayer that has a capital gains tax obligation in order for this program to work.
There's a question here about, can opportunity funds be used as collateral for debt? If you mean equity investments in opportunity funds, interestingly enough, Treasury has addressed that exact question. The answer is yes. Details obviously are to come, but we have a fundamental answer, and it is yes.
One of the questions is, can you confirm that the opportunity funds do not have to be pulled out of the project after 10 years? This is actually addressed in these regulations and will be addressed in the further regulations. So, Tim, you want to talk about the exit strategy?
The exit strategy, very basically, it contemplates holdings beyond the designation, the end of designation of opportunity zones, which is December of 2028. So it contemplates an extended holding period. They're aware of the possibility that people are just going to roll up these funds after 10 years or whenever the sunset hits, and just shut them down and move out of town. They want to avoid that, and so in general terms, the guidance allows for extended holdings of opportunity zone investments.
Yeah, what there is because of the way the law was written, and it's a 10-year law, and because of the way the Congressional Budget Office scores what something will cost, the deferred capital gains tax will have to be paid on December 31st, 2026, or when the investment is sold, whichever comes first. So there will be a moment in time where the deferred component, the deferred tax will have to be paid in 2026. That does not mean that you have to sell the property or sell the business or sell the stock, but there will be a tax event. And so what we anticipate is that the fund managers will be working with the investors about how to make sure that there are resources available for that tax event. Meanwhile, if this thing becomes a fabulous success, as we all hope, there's a realistic possibility that Congress would extend it in the same way that they've extended New Markets Tax Credit time and time again. So we have to plan as if everything will be paid on December 31st, 2026, but we also know that it's a Rubik's Cube of multiple things going on. Can the fund invest in a public-private partnership? Yes, they can.
As long as it's not a golf course.
Right. It cannot be a golf course, a massage parlor, or a bar. But it can be a public-private partnership that is not any one of those things, and it has to be an equity investment.
And there are certain sorts of P3s for which opportunity zones fit very well. Affordable housing is one of those that comes to mind.
And I think the central listing questions come up. Fundrise is created an opportunity fund, and they wanted to make sure that people knew that if you go to fundrise.com, you can find that they have a map and a variety of tools available, because they have been, as we talked about, early adapters. They certainly have been early adapters there.
And this goes, I think, to a larger point that's very, very important. To the extent that you have data, right? Performance data, economic data that characterize your community, its needs, its strengths. Data is going to empower you to tell a story to prospective investors, to tell a story to the investment bankers and the rating agencies and the equity investors. So to the extent that you have the data, that you can aggregate the data, it seems like a detail, but it's not a detail. You have to think of your data as a strategic asset that you can deploy for this cause. It will make a tremendous difference.
And here's one that you uniquely can answer, Tim, because you've been a municipal advisor. What are the potential liabilities in providing investment advice as an opportunity?
The potential liabilities, you're likely going to have to put together a prospectus. You're going to be liable for 10b5. More as a more practical matter, your investors, and this just goes to a point that that I made earlier. Your investors are going to be looking for a return like any other investors. In addition, mission-oriented investors are going to be looking for the second of the double bottom line, right? And this in a way circles back to the point I made about data. They're going to be looking for positive impact. They're going to be looking for are you making the sort of difference you say you're going to make? So again, a lot of it goes down to there's going to be pressure on you to perform in a financial sense, but there's also going to be pressure for many of these fund managers to perform in a mission sense as well. So being able to tell that story, expressing credibility through a track record of your institution and your people, and collecting data to say that you're keeping your promises is going to be very important.
And we have someone who is now wants to put the fund together as soon as possible, and he wants to know what's the best mechanisms, who's the best owner of the fund, and what. Now he's excited. He's ready to go. So what does he do?
That's great.
So now he calls you to
Well, and you're welcome to call. As a matter of fact, we're going to collect all of these questions and make an effort. I can't promise it tomorrow, but we're going to make every effort to make sure that each of these questions is satisfactorily addressed. So much depends on the particular situation, right? Of the municipality, the investors, the particular projects involved. Certainly it's going to start with fund formation, fundraising, finding suitable assets, getting everything lined up in time. I can tell you that in a general sense, but with the particulars, I can't pretend to answer that question on a specific basis.
And question, do we foresee greater clarity coming from future rounds of guidance around how equity investments can be made in early stage startups that may not have high valuations or tangible property? We anticipate that the future rounds of guidance will clarify a number of things. One of the things that in this round of guidance, Treasury specifically says if there are other issues that you believe we should address in the next round of guidance, please tell us that. And as Tim said, Treasury has been very open on this. They've been very engaged. This is a brand new idea, has never been done, and so they've been asking us, who are working with communities and investors, what do you need? But their window is they do not want this to be a difficult to operationalize program. They keep using the word, this is light touch regulation. So what we're encouraging is for people to use the guidance, but understand that there will not be specific regulatory frameworks that may be things you've been used to in the prior activities. Someone asked, once you have the PowerPoint, are you able to share it? Of course. That's, the reason you participate in IEDC is to learn things that you can then take and share in your community. So this is exactly the reason IEDC exists, is for this purpose.
We're happy to spread the gospel, and we will pointedly note that our pictures and contact information are on the back page.
Can an individual invest in a corporation that will then invest in that individual's properties? That's where you get into the self-dealing. And so that would...
I don't recall seeing specific
there's
guidance.
There's a 20% rule.
Okay.
So anytime you're trying to do something that would arguably be self-dealing, it would really be important to look carefully and have an attorney look at your particular situation, because you don't want to create something that's going to be a problem. Are multifamily the only residential projects that qualify?
They're the ones that come most easily to mind, but I'm not aware. The other that would come to mind is rent to own. I don't see any specific prohibitions against that.
Right. Is the capital tax rate frozen at the 2018? The capital tax rate is the rate at which the capital gain is realized. So when you realize your capital gain, there's a capital gains tax that is essentially assessed and then deferred. So it'll never change from that moment. But, if you do it in 2021 and the rate is different, it will be the 2021 rate. Okay, we've been approached about a collaborative multi-state fund. Is that feasible, or is it? Absolutely. You can do a national fund, you can do a multi-state, you can do a local. There is no, again, this is designed to be as flexible as possible.
There's going to be a trade-off in the market. Institutional investors are going to look for a certain amount of scale to make these projects worthwhile. On the other hand, these people are going to appreciate. Some people are going to appreciate the market focus, right? We see this in the municipal bond market. If the people are just interested in investing in the home team, so there's going to be a couple of of countervailing influences, and there's probably going to be investment that spans that spectrum.
Question is, can this be used for investment in workforce housing? Absolutely. Question, can you provide an example about how this might support an affordable housing development? We can certainly do that in the follow-up in the follow-up notes. How would investors make a profit on investing in an infrastructure project? The way you would do that is if it is a project that has, for example, a city hall that has a long-term lease, and the city pays the lease, so the owner of the building is responsible for building the building or renovating the building, maintaining the building, and they, provide that quality maintenance, and the city pays a long-term capital lease.
You've worked, Jane, on social infrastructure projects,
Right.
Healthcare facilities, educational facilities with exactly this kind of setup.
Right. We've done it with healthcare, education, affordable food. It would also work in an infrastructure project that had tolls or some kind of a revenue opportunity. And so the opportunity fund could be the equity investment. And in a P3 project that has private equity, if you have opportunity fund in equity, it would be likely willing to take a lower rate of return for a longer period of time. I think we've addressed who sets up the Qualified Opportunity Fund. Basically anyone. A taxpayer can simply file the form when they fill their taxes, fill out their taxes. If an economic development association owns the property, how can they attract an opportunity fund investor to participate in its site development? I think how you would do that is you would market it in the same way. If you know it's in an opportunity zone, you would then talk about what's the city's plan for that particular census tract, and how does that property fit into that. And you might have to put together a marketing piece. You might have to put together a presentation and try to make that presentation with some of your folks that deal with high net worth individuals. In every community, there's a chamber of commerce that deals with high net worth individuals. You've got accounting firms, law firms that do wealth management. And so these are different people than economic development folks traditionally work with. Like in a bank, usually you work with just the community development side, but there is also in the bank the private wealth management. And so it's a matter of trying to translate the work you've been doing with the community development to the private equity side, the private wealth management side.
And having worked in the public, both in the public sector and in private sector investment, I can tell you those sides of the house tend to be siloed. One of the key challenges here, but I think it's potentially very enjoyable, very productive, is to get those two sides of the house to talk to each other. That's going to be key to the success of this effort.
And our place-based nonprofits like CDCs and CDFIs, creating targeted opportunity funds, many are in the process of creating those target opportunity funds or are developing partners that will create those opportunity funds. So when we talk about the holistic approach to success, the community development financial institutions and the local community development corporations are absolutely critical to this. And we're coming up, we've got 7 minutes. We're going to try to plow through these last few questions. Someone asked, if land does not require improvement and you have a vacant lot in an urban setting, what does that mean? What that means is that your substantial improvement is building the building on the vacant lot.
Your cost basis will be more or less equal to the construction cost. The land, we expect based on the current guidance that the cost of the land would be set aside, and your basis would be the cost of putting a building on it.
And so can you start with the vacant land and build an apartment complex? Yes.
Yes.
Could an economic development set up opportunity fund? Yes. Or with a partner. And the question, can a nonprofit corporation open a local opportunity fund, and is it a good idea? The question about is it a good idea is really a local question. Some of the local nonprofit corporations, CDFIs, are extremely strong and have very strong finance backgrounds. They manage funds on a regular basis. They may have a syndication fund that they do low-income housing tax credits, and some don't. And so the answer to is it a good idea is really an assessment that you have to be made locally about whether it's best to do it as a nonprofit at the lead or do it with a partner.
So much of this boils down to credibility. It's possible for nonprofits to have, it's possible for nonprofits to play this role, but they have to convince investors why they can.
Is there anticipation of a minimum size? There is no requirement there's no minimum or maximum size of the investment. Practical reality is that it would have to be a somewhat substantial investment just because you got legal work and other kinds of things involved. And
you might be able to scale across an array of smaller projects or funds, but there has to be a certain size that's going to make the management of an opportunity fund worthwhile.
Someone says the internal rate of return on investments for small projects over a 10-year period. This is just basically what we said.
Yep.
Is there only one fund manager per opportunity zone? No, not necessarily, because within an opportunity zone, there could be multiple investments that are made. And generally, there'd be one fund manager for an opportunity fund, but not the opportunity zone. The zone is the location. The fund is the vehicle to create the investment. If the fund invests in property, is there a requirement to develop that property within a certain time period?
The working capital stipulations that we touched on earlier are largely intended to address this. The 31 months. The Treasury understands that buildings don't build themselves. On the other hand, they don't want you to have the capital sitting around indefinitely. So the working capital stipulations that we talked about are probably best to answer that question.
And it's also not designed to be a land bank. It's actually, right. You have to, in order to make the program work, the value of the property that you invest in, whether that's stock, real estate property, or tangible property, has to increase over the 10-year period as a result of investment. So if you just hold it, that is not necessarily going to happen. Question about what the role of a foundation, I think we've spoken to that. Can an investor purchase property upon the completion of the improvements? The investor can purchase at any point through the opportunity fund. The investor wouldn't do it directly. So whether the improvements have once the opportunity fund takes it, there's a requirement for the substantial improvement. So if you buy something that is already at the top of its game, it's going to be difficult to meet the substantial improvement test. Who is the typical investor? You want to take that one, Tim?
By the intent of the legislation, the investor is going to be characterized as a U.S. taxpayer with realized capital gains. What does that mean? It means, potentially institutional investors such as insurance companies, come to mind, potentially, private equity firms or wealth management firms. I think high net worth, again, because of the combination of realized capital gains and community involvement, high net worth individuals are likely to play a significant role in the space. So, again, domestic investors with realized capital gains, that's going to be the unifying factor. It transcends both individuals and institutions because of the nature of the incentive. It's probably going to be individuals specifically at the upper end of the income tiers who participate.
And someone has been doing their homework and they read that a qualified opportunity fund can invest in property, business, or business assets. And they want to know, what is a business asset that's not a building or land?
Equipment would be a prime example. Inventory, for example, the toys in your toy store, the forklift you use to transfer shipments of toys from store to store, that would count as business assets.
Okay, Tim, I just got the tap on the shoulder from the IEDC staffer who said we have run out of time.
Was that a tap on the shoulder, or was that a hook?
I think it was a hook. So I really appreciate the questions that you all have put together, and we will try to summarize these and do some answers. And if in the survey you feel like we should do a follow-up, we would be open to doing a follow-up kind of webinar, because there are just so many questions, and I think that we all learn from each other asking the questions, and we might be able to do sort of round two of this as we move forward. So remember, do the survey. If you do the survey, you'll get the link to the PowerPoint, which has all of the details, including both Tim and my photos and contact information. We'd be happy to try to help you on a going forward basis. We're both in the business of continuing to help people with this. So thank you very much. We look forward to hearing from you.
We hope you found this helpful, and thank you everyone for your time.